Have you ever stopped to think about why the war between Israel and Iran seems never-ending? Could it be that this dispute goes beyond geopolitics, UN agreements, and the headlines we see every day? In this video, you will discover that it all begins way back, with Abraham and a divine promise that shapes not only the history of the Middle East, but the eternal destiny of millions. Here you will understand how the separation between Isaac and Ishmael sparked a rivalry that echoes to this day, involving Arab nations, the 12 tribes of Israel, and a spiritual heritage that influences peace or war in that sacred land. If you want to go beyond the surface, grasp the spiritual conflict behind territorial disputes, and find out how the eternal promise can bring hope, this video is for you. So, before you move on to the next headline about conflict, stay with me and see how this ancient story can change your worldview, and even your life. Ready to understand the true root of this war? Let's unravel this mystery together. The war in the Middle East didn't start yesterday, or even last century. The real beginning lies in a divine promise made to a man named Abraham, at a time when there was no UN, borders, or treaties. God spoke to Abraham and promised him a land, a numerous offspring, and an eternal spiritual inheritance. Genesis 12. This is where God's plan begins to unfold, and like every grand plan, it involves choices, sacrifices, and conflicts. Abraham believed the promise, but there was one detail. His wife Sarah was barren. Imagine the weight of that. God promises descendants, yet no children are in sight. In human desperation, Sarah offers her servant Hagar to bear a child. Ishmael is born in this context, a strong son, but outside the original promise. This reveals something profound. Not every human alternative is approved by God, even if it seems to work at the moment. Ishmael represents many of today's Arab nations, with roots in a birth marked by resistance and pain. From there, a powerful warrior lineage began, marked by a sense of injustice and search for belonging. On the other side, God still had another plan. Isaac, the promised son, would be born to Sarah herself. And that is where the true line of the covenant is revealed, not by human effort but by divine intervention. Isaac's birth wasn't just a miracle, it was a sign that God's plan doesn't depend on human limitations. While Ishmael grew strong, Isaac was the symbol of the eternal promise and future reconciliation among peoples. Abraham loved both sons, but God had already set the path of the covenant. It would pass through Isaac. This laid the foundation for the separation between spiritual inheritance and earthly blessing. It's as if history is saying, not every blessing guarantees a covenant. God blessed Ishmael with 12 princes, yes, 12, like the 12 tribes of Israel, but the eternal promise went in another direction. And this already shows that the conflict between brothers isn't just about blood, it's about purpose. Even today in Middle Eastern geopolitics, we see the marks of this separation. Jerusalem, for example, isn't just a city, it's the epicenter of this spiritual dispute. What few understand is that this division wasn't only familial, it was prophetic. That's where the spiritual rivalry between nations began, perpetuating itself as territorial, ideological, and even religious conflict. Watching the clashes between Israel and Arab nations is like witnessing a millennial story repeating its pages. And it all started with a hasty decision, with a mother trying to help God fulfill his word. But there's something deeper at work here. It's not just brothers drifting apart, but spiritual paths laid out since the womb. And now, looking at today's conflicts, we are merely harvesting the fruits of a seed planted millennia ago. And that leads us to reflect on what really separated Ishmael and Isaac. The separation between Ishmael and Isaac wasn't just a family crisis. It was the beginning of a spiritual division that still echoes in every dispute in the Middle East. Ishmael grew under Abraham's watchful eye, who deeply loved him. But when Isaac was born, tension became inevitable. It was as if heaven itself had defined two distinct paths, the one of divine promise and the one of blessing without covenant. The rivalry between the brothers showed itself early. Ishmael, the older, mocked Isaac, the miraculous heir. What might have seemed like childish teasing actually carried prophetic weight. The conflict between brothers would turn into war between nations. Sarah, seeing this, didn't hesitate. She asked for Hagar and Ishmael to be sent away, fearing for Isaac's spiritual destiny. That decision broke Abraham's heart, but God intervened. And here is the key point. God himself said, "Listen to Sarah, for in Isaac shall your offspring be called." Genesis 21:12. It wasn't a rejection of Ishmael as a person, but a clear definition of who would carry the eternal promise. Ishmael would father powerful nations, but Isaac would be the bearer of the covenant. This is the moment when the concept of rejection and election is born. Ishmael was separated physically, but also spiritually. His lineage would grow in the desert, with strength and endurance, like a warrior nation. Isaac, on the other hand, would become the direct link between Abraham and the future of Israel. This rupture is so deep that even today it defines who sees themselves as the legitimate heir of the Promised Land. The expulsion of Ishmael symbolizes much more than a family drama. It is the image of the spiritual conflict that persists between those who follow God's plan and those who fight outside it. Many today live this same feeling of rejection, feeling like Ishmael, trying to prove their worth outside of what God has determined. But even in the desert, God cares. He blesses, even outside the main promise. It is curious to notice how this division also affects geopolitics. The Arab nations, descendants of Ishmael, continue disputing the spiritual inheritance of Jerusalem. The UN tries to mediate peace but ignores what lies behind it. It is not just a territorial dispute, it is a war for identity. Every attack, every resistance, carries echoes of a brotherly conflict that began thousands of years ago. And if Abraham's heart suffered in that separation, imagine God's. Because to him, both sons were important, but only one would carry the thread of redemption that culminated in Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. And it is exactly there that this story begins to point to a much greater outcome, which is still to come. While Isaac grew under the divine promise, Ishmael followed a harsh path, but full of vigor. Both had Abraham's blood, but their destinies ran like rivers that would never meet again. Isaac would father Jacob, who became Israel and father of the 12 tribes. Ishmael, meanwhile, would become father of 12 princes, leaders of Arab clans. And so, the seeds of rivalry were sown. Isaac's children would inherit the covenant, the eternal promise, the promised land, the eternal destiny linked to God's plan. Ishmael's descendants would spread across the desert, taking root in regions that today make up much of the Middle East. Both grew as nations, both became strong, but there was an invisible difference that separated them: the spiritual inheritance. Jacob, later called Israel, would have his 12 sons who would give their names to the tribes of Israel. They would form a people guided by prophecies, shaped by wars, led by the divine promise of redemption. The Ishmaelites, however, would develop far from the covenant, but close to resistance, independence, and hostility. The desert trained them, rejection forged them, rivalry inflamed them. If we look at the current conflicts, we realize they are not just border disputes. It is Isaac's descendants against Ishmael's descendants. It is the continuation of the brotherly conflict, where the UN becomes only a powerless referee before a spiritual clash. And the city of Jerusalem? It is the beating heart of this dispute, the symbol of the inheritance both claim. Many see the war between Israel and the Arab peoples as a political issue, but the root lies in Genesis. It is about identity. It is about who the true heirs of the promise are. It is a silent struggle spanning centuries and exploding in headlines. But it began way back, with 2 boys, 2 brothers, and 2 distinct promises. And to this day, the Middle East carries this division like an open scar. While Jacob's descendants await the full restoration of Israel and the coming of the Messiah, many of Ishmael's children also await a Redeemer. Both believe in a greater destiny, but walk opposing paths. This separation of paths reveals one of the greatest spiritual tensions in history, a rivalry between brothers that did not end with childhood but matured over time. And perhaps the most intriguing thing of all is to realize that, even with such different paths, both are connected to the same God. The same Creator who made promises to Abraham also heard Ishmael's cry. The same Lord who gave the land to Israel also gave nations to Ishmael. But true reconciliation has not yet happened. And this is where a prophetic element comes in, going far beyond the past. Behind every war, every bomb dropped, every international protest, there is a spiritual conflict that few can see. The tension between Israel and the Arab nations is not limited to borders on a map. It is a dispute for identity, for legacy, for spiritual inheritance. It is Isaac and Ishmael fighting not only for land, but over which of them truly carries God's plan. The Promised Land, especially Jerusalem, is not just a geographical location. It represents the divine connection between heaven and earth. That is why so many territorial conflicts end up focusing there. Jerusalem has become the center of prophetic geopolitics. It is the city where the past, present, and eternal destiny of the world intertwine. It is no coincidence that everyone wants to place it under their banner. Psalm 83 could not be more current. It describes a conspiracy of nations around Israel. They said, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation." This psalm echoes through the halls of the UN in resolutions trying to neutralize Israel. But the truth is that peace treaties and diplomatic negotiations do not reach the heart of the problem, because it is not just politics, but a spiritual war dragging on since Genesis. Look closely. While the world debates territories, God talks about destinies. And when there is confusion about the purpose, resistance is born. The UN tries to put out a fire that did not start in modern history. This fire started in the hearts of two boys, sons of Abraham, and will only be extinguished when the Prince of Peace reigns. Until then, we will see hostility disguised as diplomacy, and wars fought with promises in ruins. Biblical prophecy helps us see beyond the headlines. The resistance of the Arab peoples is not only against Israel, but against the eternal promise made by God. The brotherly conflict became a confrontation between nations. And many who live in these countries have no idea that they carry in their veins the story of an ancient rejection, but also the possibility of reconciliation. And this affects the whole world. After all, the Middle East is the spiritual heart of humanity. There everything began. There the Messiah was promised. There is the key to redemption. When we ignore the spiritual side of the conflict, we lose sight of God's plan. And without this vision, human solutions become bandages on wounds still open, bleeding history and pain. But there is a thread of hope in this ancient story. A promise made to Abraham that has not yet been fully fulfilled. A reconciliation that will not come through weapons nor diplomacy, but through redemption. And this thread leads us directly to the next part of this journey, the prophecies and the role of the Messiah in this greater plan. While the world revolves around agreements and treaties, there is a silent but powerful plan being unfolded in heaven, God's plan. The prophets already pointed with impressive accuracy to a time when true peace would reign. Isaiah, for example, saw beyond the war. He saw a throne being established, and upon it, the Prince of Peace. This divine promise still pulses in attentive hearts. Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, did not come by chance. He is the link between what was said to Abraham and what is yet to come. In Galatians 3:29, Paul reveals something explosive. If we belong to Christ, we are Abraham's descendants and heirs of the promise. This changes everything. It means that reconciliation between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael necessarily passes through Jesus. Without him, there is no true peace. With him, everything realigns. What few understand is that redemption is not just a theological concept. It is a spiritual movement with geopolitical impact. A descendant of Ishmael today can find in Jesus the same access to God's plan as a Messianic Jew. This does not nullify history, but transforms destiny. The covenant expands. The eternal promise embraces those who were once outside. And this is where the conflict begins to lose strength. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he was not just talking about good intentions, but a mission. Being a peacemaker, in this context, means living as an instrument of reconciliation. Want to apply this? Then pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Study the scriptures, especially Genesis, Isaiah, and the Gospels. Invest time in understanding how prophecy shapes the present. Don't limit yourself to the news. Dive into the promises. The Messiah came to unify. And this unity is not political, but spiritual. It is not about a new treaty, but a new creation. The 12 tribes of Israel, the Arab peoples, the children of Isaac and those of Ishmael, all can find a new beginning in Christ. Does this sound utopian? Maybe. But faith has always been the fuel of the impossible. And God's plan has never depended on the approval of nations. That is why, even amid war, there is hope. Even facing rivalry, there is redemption. Because biblical prophecy is not just prediction, it is direction. And this direction points to a reconciliation no government has been able to achieve. Only the Messiah can restore what was broken way back then, between two brothers. And this leads us to reflect. If he is the link, why do we still insist on living apart? There is an ancient cry echoing through the mountains of the Middle East, a cry for peace, for meaning, for reconciliation. And this answer will not come through the UN, nor world leaders. It will come when eyes turn to the Messiah, when the world realizes that the true spiritual inheritance is not in flags, but in blood shed out of love. And that is where the end of this story begins to unfold. The war between Israel and its neighbors has deep roots, spanning generations. But what you learned here goes far beyond the headlines and superficial news. Now it is time to reflect. How can you apply this understanding in your life? Isn't it time to look beyond the visible conflicts and perceive God's plan at work even when all seems lost? This is the key to understanding your own eternal destiny.
Think. Have you carried spiritual or emotional conflicts that, like the separation between Isaac and Ishmael, create unnecessary rivalries and resistance in your life? How can the Prince of Peace act there? What practical steps can you take to seek reconciliation where there is rejection? Meditating on divine promises, investing in biblical readings focused on peace like Isaiah and the Gospels, and practicing empathy are simple but transformative actions. I'd like to know, which of these points impacted you the most? Have you ever felt the weight of an inner war that, once understood, can be transformed into true peace? Share your experiences and doubts in the comments because this conversation is meant to be alive and ongoing. Dive deeper into the spiritual inheritance that connects you to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and let God's plan guide your journey. If this video brought you a new perspective, imagine how much more you can discover here on the channel. So don't waste time. Subscribe and turn on notifications to not miss the upcoming analyses and stories that will help you understand the world and yourself in a way few can. Let's go together on this journey of knowledge and transformation. Remember, the lasting peace everyone seeks will only be full when the Messiah reigns over the whole earth. Until then, the invitation is for you to be an agent of reconciliation, an heir of the promise living the eternal destiny for which you were called. The war between brothers may be ancient, but the victory of peace is certain, and it starts within you. So shall we put this learning into practice? How about starting today by investing in Bible studies, prayers, and acts of peace in your daily life? Change begins in the small, the simple, the sincere gesture. This is the first step to an impact that reverberates far beyond your personal circle.